Hello, everyone, and welcome to our other talk within the Nine-Sided Circle. This is our talk that we do once monthly. If you're familiar with our usual schedule, we usually do our 6:30 p.m. Pacific time talk. And for the folks who can't make that on a regular basis, we meet every third Sunday our morning time at 10:30 a.m. instead. Well, actually, we do two talks today. So if you make it to this one, yay! And if you make it to the other one, yay! And if you make it to both, then you are just a very dedicated person, and we applaud
Or crazy.
You.
You could be crazy.
All right. So with that said, we do need to do our little YouTube spiel, and I will try to keep it quick since we do have to do that twice today, and nobody likes doing it when they have to do it all the time. So like, comment, or subscribe. Any and all of those things would be super helpful to us as we continue to organically grow our channel and connect with more and more people. So if you like our stuff, please engage. It helps us out a lot, and we really appreciate it.
And if you're really crazy, share our videos.
Yeah, we rarely, ask for that, but that is also another way you can really help us out. Other than that, you can
Or you could make fun of us that way. Look at these crazy people.
That is up to you. Whatever you feel is your motivation, roll with it. I guess any publicity can be good publicity, as it were. Other than that, do I need to add anything else in terms
Nope,
of
we're
spiel?
still going to be in Sweden in May.
Yes.
And there's still a couple of slots open for the retreat. So
Yeah.
if you want to do something that will be very interesting and have a vacation at the same time in one of the most beautiful spots in Northern Europe, sign up.
Yeah, and you can do that in the description. We will have a link with more information as well as an email sign up, which will get you in touch with us so that we can talk about how to get you registered for that event. And we, as of right now, our registration is open until March 12th. We're going to see how this goes, but right now that is our cutoff point. So if you're interested, act before then so that you can be sure to have a spot. All right. Anything else?
Nah.
That's happening in May, by the way. The retreat's happening May 8th through 12th in Sweden. It's going to be awesome. Okay. So without further ado, thank you for sitting tight for the spiel and all that stuff. Let's talk about what we're going to talk about today. So, of course, we usually try to tie our two talks together. But this morning, we're going to be starting with a discussion about spiritual chivalry, or Futtuwah in Arabic. I don't know if I said that correctly, Wael. I'm sure that you can help us out. I got a thumbs up. Yay. All right, great. So, Mushtaq, where should we begin?
We should begin with what it is and what it isn't, because in the West, we have a very different idea of this concept when we say chivalry. The word chivalry comes from the French, and it comes from the French word for horse. A chevalier is a horseman. To be chivalrous is literally to be a horseman. Now, how did this turn into something as interesting as it might be? Chivalry comes from the Middle East, the concept. It came up through Spain, and people like Raymond Lull came in contact with it. Raymond Lull, who we know as the Blessed Raymond Lull, was a Catholic near saint who was a mystic and wrote all sorts of stuff. He made several trips across the waters down into the Maghreb, into northern Africa, where he supposedly was trying to convert them all to Christianity, but obviously was also studying what he could. He spoke fluent Arabic. He was from Murcia in Spain, so I think he was from Murcia, and from Spain, and aside from all of his mystical writings, he also wrote a manual on chivalry, one of the earliest, wherein he suggested that to be a knight, one had to have a moral code. And if you know anything about the European knights, they were basically brigands. They were the noblemen of the Middle Ages were the best robbers and thieves of the time. That's pretty much how they got their position. And so all of a sudden into that was injected this idea that, oh, in order to be a knight, you had to have a moral code. And that is important. There's an old Japanese story. It goes kind of like this. There was a pond, and all of the denizens of the pond decided that they needed a king. And they all got together, and the frogs and the lizards and everybody in the pond got together and decided who should be our king. Somebody said, Heron should be our king because Heron is the greatest warrior here in the pond. And so they all went up to Heron and said, be our king. And Heron said, sure. In about 2 weeks, there was nobody living in the pond. Heron had eaten them all. The moral of this story is that the warrior should never be the king. The warrior must serve something greater than himself. Otherwise, he'll devour everything. This is the basis of European chivalry. Take these rowdy, basically robbers. I mean, the term robber baron comes from this period, right? It wasn't the Industrial Revolution. It was these barons sitting on the road and basically robbing everybody who came by. And if they were smart, they would only rob them of a little bit. And if they weren't so smart, they would rob them of everything, in which case nobody came by their castle anymore. So, in the East, the idea that we call chivalry took a different form. It still had the moral context, but it was not exclusively for ennobled warriors. Anybody could be chivalrous. Anybody could be a member of a chivalric group, because that's one of the things that happened. And what do you get from this? You get people who strive to have noble behavior, not just good behavior, but noble behavior. Selflessness, generosity, always moving to support the good in one's community. And these are all good ideas, right? And they are all designed to keep the ego in check. And in the Islamic world, I love that term, Islamic, there was a militaristic aspect to this. There's a saying, there is no noble youth, no fatah, except for Ali. Ali was the son-in-law of the Prophet, his cousin, married to the Prophet's daughter, Fatima. And he was, by all accounts, probably the best warrior in Arabia. I mean, he was crazy good, and he would do amazing feats. And at the same time, he embodied these noble qualities. There is a story of, back then they would fight single combat. That was a big thing. My army comes up, your army comes up, we send out our champions to fight. Sometimes that will end the battle right there. And there's a story of Ali fighting in single combat. And the guy who he's fighting spits in his face, calls him names, and Ali steps back. And he spends, he basically called a timeout. And he spent a couple of minutes pacing back and forth. And then he fought again. The end of the story varies. I've heard different endings. The one I like is that he defeats his opponent, and his opponent cries for mercy, and his opponent asks him, "Why did you stop?" And he said, "You made me angry. And if I had killed you out of anger, I would have been killing you for myself, for my own ego. So I had to put my anger in check before I continued." And of course, the guy immediately converted to Islam, and everybody lived happily ever after. That is an example of the chivalrous warrior in Islam. Does that make sense? Yes, no, maybe?
Yeah, people are nodding. Yep.
Good.
Any questions so far?
Yeah.
Yeah.
There is an example in one of the books on chivalry that I forget who it was again. Somebody comes up to this guy and says, I think this is on the duties of brotherhood. He says, "Brother, can you lend me $5?" And the guy just reaches into his pocket, takes out his wallet, and hands it to the guy and says, "Use what you need and return the wallet later." That's an example of, I mean, how many of us would do that? Think about that. How many of us would do something like that? And yet, that was the kind of thing that we saw back in those days, of this incredible generosity, this willingness to put your friends, your companions before yourself, to make them prime in your life. And they're doing the same thing to you. So everybody's going to be fighting over who gets to give the other person the money. It'd be very embarrassing. All these wallets coming out.
Yes. YL says Imam Ali was also very known to take care of orphans.
Yes. He and his wife lived pretty much in poverty. I mean, here he is, the son-in-law of the prophet, married to the daughter of the prophet. They should have lots and lots of money, but he and his wife gave away everything to people who they felt were in more need than them. And that was just a thing that he did. Not to there's lots of examples of this. Abu Bakr, who was another companion of the Prophet and father of one of the Prophet's wives, was known to be incredibly generous as well. They say that when they came to Medina, the Prophet asked people to donate money to support everyone. And they say that Abu Bakr gave everything that he had to the support of the community. And basically emptied out his entire coffer. So here you have a moral code that says you are going to be generous. You are going to protect people who are powerless. You are going to hold yourself to a very, very high ethical standard. Now, how does this begin to manifest in the world? People, as it is today, once you get an idea like this, people write books, and then the books get passed around. You know, we know today that you ain't nobody until you've written a book. So there are a few books on chivalry. One is what is it called? The Book of Spiritual Chivalry by al-Sulami. That's the easiest one to find. And you can find PDF copies of it floating around.
Yes.
It's translated by Tosin Barak, I think.
Okay, yeah, so that's by Sulami.
Yeah, Sulami. And then there's the Royal Book of Sufi Chivalry, which is really hard to find. And there's a book called The Duties of Brotherhood, which are kind of the same, in the same vein. All of these give you what the code is, or their understanding of what the code is. And the code boils down to take care of people, live a good life, don't be an asshole. And that evolved in various interesting ways. The idea of Futtuwah, of spiritual chivalry, is pre-Islamic. And I know, I should have looked this up, but I know that there was a bunch of gathering of like-minded people to do this before the Prophet became the Prophet. And I know he was involved in at least one of them that approached the duties of brotherhood. You can look it up, because this is not a scholarly dissertation on spiritual chivalry in Islam. This is something different. It's an old concept. It's a concept that is spread. It's a concept that I am convinced affected European philosophy in the Dark Ages. And from it, various things evolved. The trade guilds that you find, especially in Ottoman Turkey, you had these Ahi guilds, which were basically associated, like metalwork and weaving, whatever. What we would now think of as trade guilds were chivalrous guilds. They were guilds that were based on these ideas of Futtuwah. You also have, out of Iran, and this affected the entire Middle East over time, the Zurkhane. That means basically house of strength, house of power. And these were brotherhoods that got together, and they did physical exercise. based on combat sports. And so they would swing clubs and do weird push-up routines and lift heavy weights and all of this, and they would wrestle. And they were a place that instilled moral value. And they exist even to this day. You can go out and join one if you're in the right area. And so this began to focus the ideas of what were your obligations as a chivalrous person. The word fata, by the way, it means a youth, a noble youth. So this was associated with the idea of youth and vigor and young people and all of this kind of stuff. And that kind of hints at one of the purposes of this. Do you know what the lines on a map represent? You look at it like a map of Europe or a map of the Middle East, and you see these lines that delineate this is one country and this is the other. Do you know what they actually represent? They represent the spots where large groups of teenagers fought each other to a standstill. That's how you get those lines. Get a bunch of kids, they all, suit up and run out and bash each other over the head until they're too tired to go on. Then they make a treaty. You call that a border. This happens for a couple of reasons. One, kids are stupid. Seriously.
Yeah.
Reckless. Think about it. You're an 18-year-old kid. You're in the military. Your sergeant says, see that hill up there with all of them slavering peoples with rocks and sticks and spears and stuff to throw down on you? I want you to charge up that hill and take it away from them. An 18-year-old is going to go, yowza, and go charging up. Somebody my age is going to stab the sergeant and sneak off into the night because we know what's going to happen if we go up that hill. So young people, fatas, are passionate, but they lack a certain, what would you call it? Survival instinct is part of it, but
pacing,
and they also lack a moral compass. You can get kids to commit atrocities much easier than you can get older people, as a rule. Older people might talk atrocity, but their arthritis is too bad for them to go out and do it. So for young people, it is important that they connect up with something that gives them values beyond themselves. Chivalry was one way that it was done amongst the noble classes in Europe. Chivalry only counted for the nobles. If you didn't have money and land, nobody cared what your morals were because you were dead by 20 anyway.
This is a dark talk this morning.
This is, yeah, but we got to go through this part so you can understand the necessity for this.
Yeah, definitely.
So here in the West, what have we done? We created the Boy Scouts. The Boy Scouts is a chivalrous organization. And its idea was to train young men to be, what was it, trustworthy, loyal, helpful, brave, courteous, kind, friendly, reverent. God, it's been so many years, I don't even remember anymore. To train young men to be decent human beings. This is best done in groups. Think about that. This is best done in groups because you need a certain amount of peer pressure to go, hey, that's okay. This is not okay. So we don't do this. Why don't we do this? Because it's not okay. It's not chivalrous. It
Also
goes
get
against the,
badges.
yeah, we also get badges. The badges are for the acquisition of skill and knowledge, which is something else that, I mean, think about the trade guilds. What do you get in a trade guild? You get a trade. You get to learn how to do something cool that will support you for your whole life. You know, in the Boy Scouts, you get badges for learning particular skills that are supposed to be life enhancing, like how to build a fire.
And eventually they had the Girl Scouts, and it's the same
Yeah,
thing, ideally.
same thing. Yeah. Yeah, we got to talk about this is not gender based at its ultimate level, but we're looking historically right now.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
So this is not one of the exciting talks. This is kind of we're going to plod through this talk. So here you have a fundamental idea of, especially when you're young, you need the guidance of a moral standard and you need group support in order to teach yourself to embody that standard. Because maybe you want to go out and pillage that little town over there, but everybody else around you is going, you're going to be a real dick if you do that. It's against the code to go and pillage that village. And so you don't do it, and you think about it. And maybe 20 years later, you're telling the same thing to somebody else. That's the basis of it. Now, Sufism and Futtuwah became seriously connected at a certain point. And here's how that works. And this is the secret stuff. All of the people with short attention spans have left by now. And so now we can talk about the real deal here. Chivalry gives us what we should do. Sufism teaches us how to change ourselves in such a way that we can do this, that it becomes natural for us. That's how they came together, and that's what's important. You can't just go to somebody, hey, don't be an asshole.
yeah,
They'll go, oh, yeah, that's a great idea.
what does that even mean? Yeah.
Yeah.
What does it mean to not be an asshole? How do I do that? What am I doing that might be assholey? I don't even know.
Yeah. And if I am doing an assholey thing, how do I change it?
Mm-hmm.
So the one thing that the Futtuwah groups, that the chivalrous groups didn't have were the techniques by which they could transform themselves from assholes into chivalrous individuals. And you find in the history, in military history, you find these ideas keep creeping in. Like you look at the Knights Templar, right? They started out as assholes, and through a lot of contact with other peoples in the Middle East, they started getting ideas about how they could improve themselves. At least that's the story. I wasn't there, I don't know. And opinions vary. Depending on which books you read, the Templars were either incredibly cool or just complete worthless individuals. But you find that over and over again. We look at Ottoman Turkey, and they had the Yanaçari or Janissaries. Slave soldiers is one definition of them, because they were recruited as children from non-Muslim families around the Ottoman Empire. They were brought to the seat of the empire in Istanbul, and they were trained from earliest youth. They were taught Islam. They were basically sorted into two categories as they went through their education. One category was military, and they became the Janissaries, and the other category was the people who became the administrators of the empire. Part of the rationale for this was that they had no clan ties. And so they were going to be more loyal to the government than people who were at first loyal to their families. It worked really well. It worked so well that Muslim families would hide the fact that they were Muslim so they could get their kids into this. Because you were set for life if you were part of this. And yes, they were technically slaves, but they were slaves with an incredible amount of secular power. Each of the Janissary groups had a Sufi attached to them, specifically a Bektashi dervish, which acted as a chaplain to each of the military groups to teach them the techniques by which they could embody the qualities of chivalry. And from a military standpoint, it worked really well. The Janissaries were arguably the best infantry troops on the planet during their heyday, which is how we got an Ottoman Empire. Now, I am not suggesting that we need more Janissaries. I am suggesting that we need more chivalry. So, in the modern day, what do you think the qualities of a chivalrous person would be?
They would treat others as a subject, not object. They would treat women or members of the opposite gender with equality. They would give to charity and take care of people who they wouldn't gain any real benefit from, but feel that it's the right thing to do, like people who are old, orphans. They can't get anything back for helping them, but I imagine a chivalrous person in today's world would do things like that?
One would expect so. And they would work together with others to do that. I mean, think of the Girl Scouts. Every year they sell cookies. What do they sell the cookies for? To raise money so that they can teach young women and girls how to be better people. And to do good work in the community.
Jonathan.
Yeah, I would say that what the new generation would have to be taught would be how to think and how to feel, not what to think and what to feel. Then they'd be independent. They can come up with their own code of chivalry.
And do you think they might benefit from some suggestions?
For sure. Plenty of exercises and suggestions.
But you hit upon a very important point. Part of chivalry is knowing how to think and how to feel. And there's something popping up here on the, I saw
James
coming up with something, yeah.
I mean, this might be related to your thought, Jonathan.
Yeah.
But first, I want to just, when you say how to think and how to feel, what does that mean to you when you say it? Like,
so if
the difference there.
It's difficult to, I'm going to try and describe it with thinking.
Yeah, sure.
Our modern education system works on a basis of you've got to learn all this stuff and you've got to repeat it back perfectly, and then we'll give you the A's, give you the pass mark. That is not being taught how to think. That's being taught what to think. So you're limited in your scope of what you can do. You can't move outside of what you're taught. You can only revolve within the education system. But there's ways of teaching how to think. The processes of thought patterns and reasoning, and then you're suddenly free to discover whatever you can discover.
Yeah, and I think that is definitely part of this, and that is part of what Sufism brings in to this chivalry thing, in that it allows this increased flexibility that pushes against the rigidity of what much of our culture is about. So I think you're right. Thank you, Jonathan.
Yeah, the concept of learning how to think has become very unpopular in the modern world. I remember a few years ago, the Republican Party of Texas came out with their platform, and part of their platform was a stand against critical thinking and higher order thinking being taught in schools.
Blowing.
You know, I had to pick my jaw up off the floor when I came across to that one. But they were like, parents should teach their children what to think and how to think, preferably from the Bible.
Yeah.
But yeah, and we don't teach thinking skills anymore. We don't teach reasoning. The only time that a kid might bump into that accidentally is in algebra class. And they're going to be hating algebra class because they don't understand what they're doing.
Yeah. So I would like to read James's
yes,
comment.
Please.
All right. James says, the objectifying tendency that any culture risks seems to be in full swing in modern pop culture. Without a real conscious chivalry, young men in particular will fall into the clutches of Andrew Tate, Jordan Peterson, etc. I think specifically of things that I've read about Jordan Peterson when I didn't spend too much time on this, but I have friends who have. And one of their feelings about the attraction towards someone like Jordan Peterson is this sense of, wow, this person is telling me a way to, in their minds, be a more grounded, healthy, activated person in the world. And they felt like they were lacking that kind of role model. And Jordan Peterson stood out to them as for them, what appeared to be a quality role model. I'm sure many of us here, if not all of us, would feel differently about that. But when there's a vacuum, something is likely to come in and fill it.
Yeah. And again, that's an example going back to what Jonathan was saying. If you actually had critical thinking skills and you listened to Jordan Peterson talk, you would realize he's an idiot.
Yeah, well, if you're looking for something, you're hungry for it, you're gonna fixate on that. Yeah.
Yep. And that's
So,
the same thing with Andrew Tate. Andrew Tate offers an example of manhood that is antithetical to chivalry, but it would take the place of it since there is nobody teaching proper chivalry. And, it's toxic. People will suffer for what he is espousing, but if it's all you got, what are you going to do?
yeah. James, I saw you were unmuted. Did you have thoughts you wanted to add?
I always have thoughts. I'm quite full of them. It's interesting for me because I'm watching one of my nephews become quite enamored of Tate and Peterson. And we had our Australian equivalent, this guy called Avi Yemeni, who was an ultra right-wing Zionist, but he's now done a bunk and run off to the States. But particularly with Peterson, you see almost like the lowest point in a descending curve of Jungian theory. And it's the attraction a lot of Jungians seem to feel for very conservative interpretations of culture. They start with Jung, then you got Mercy Eliade, Joseph Campbell, and then you've got the very bottom of the curve. You've got Peterson with the worst example of pseudo-archetypal pseudo-theory. I'm sorry, it's a button of mine that's very easy to press. So I've had my rant. And now I'll let the whole thing continue. That's it. I'm done. It's all good.
You definitely touched on some things I recall being part of the discussion, and that's powerful stuff for people, like I said, who feel like there's a lack of conversations about these things, and they're looking for some way to. I think of it as a hunger, yeah, and
yes,
you have an appetite that you're trying to satiate.
yes. And that hunger is great, but our popular culture is a thing based on consumption, not depth.
Right.
So that it arrives at this crisis, it's not all surprising.
I totally agree. Thank you, James.
Yep. But those are good examples of what we're dealing with today. People,
M has a thought.
Yes.
Yeah, sorry, I just wanted to add what we're dealing against. It's so strong and from so many streams. Children are being taught that it's cool to be defiant and rude to your parents, for instance, to be cruel, to be mean. They're all shown as cool things to be. And then we have the stream of things like music, where I heard recently that the song that got 6 Grammy Awards is all about, I can't even get myself to say it, but like we have music that actually fill brains and hearts with filth, and it seems to be the things that, you know, are cool to listen for kids. All the messages in all that music is very destructive morally. The other day I was at the supermarket and there was literally a 10-year-old and maybe a 7-year-old, 7, 8-year-old, and they were talking about it's just too sad to say. I'll leave it at that. We're what we're up against, it needs to really be identified and understood before we can actually really understand the need of what we're talking about here today. I actually went to Jordan Peterson's talk when he came to Sydney. It was a ticket given to me by somebody, and I thought, well, why not? I'll go. And the stadium was, the theater was full, chock-a-block full, and they weren't cheap tickets. Like, yes, people are hungry, and this people like Jordan Peterson stand up for, you know, be the man, be the woman, be the person who stands up for the right and the righteous and the good. And there is a market for people who are hungry to know more about, it's important to know yourself, but they have no role model and no example. And the cultures that actually had something to offer have been so demonized that you don't even get a chance to actually start having a conversation until you build a friendship or rapport, and that could take years. And even then they'll think, oh, well, that's your way, you know, and so it's what we're up against is also important to understand, I think, to be able to really uphold what we are for.
And that gets into an interesting thing. Somebody has suggested a long time ago, and I'm pretty sure that they were right, that gangs are what you get when children do not have any way to become adults, and so attempt to create a situation where they can reach adulthood. And that's based on the theory that children learn to be adults by hanging out with adults. You need an example. And if they have no example, they'll try and make one. And they'll always get it wrong. They'll always get it wrong. Children cannot help children become adults. That's like a caterpillar does not teach other caterpillars to be a butterfly.
You have to go through it.
Yeah, and you have to have examples of people who have achieved the state that as a young person you long for. And that is what you get in both Sufi communities and some of the old Islamic trade guilds and the Fatah communities that existed, is people who can be living examples of what it is that people are striving for. If you think about it, every little boy wants to be a knight. And however that translates in whatever culture they're in. But if they have no examples of what that knighthood is, then they're going to fail miserably. This is also true, as far as I can tell, for little girls.
Yeah, I mean, there's this saying that you can't become what you can't imagine. And if you don't have examples of the possibilities, if you don't have something to look to and be like, wow, I guess it's possible for me to do that, then it's very hard to make that thing that you hunger for a reality in your own life.
Yeah.
And little girls experience that acutely. Jonathan.
Yeah, I fully agree. And my ideas, that of, oh, you've got to teach someone how to think and how to feel is, yeah, they're all very noble ideas, but for a child, it's not realistic to expect a 10-year-old to be thinking for themselves or to know how to feel for themselves. There's a long period throughout youth where you need to follow by example. And even if it's mechanical.
Mm-hmm.
So if you could be reaching the age of 18 and behaving nobly in a completely mechanical way, you can learn your thinking and feeling at that point, and then decide if you want to continue with your noble behavior. You might alter it, you might continue with it, but for that whole childhood period, I fully agree. Just copy someone who's behaving nobly if you are lucky enough to find someone.
Yeah. I used to live in Tanzania, which is in East Africa, just south of Kenya. And there is a tribal people there called the Maasai. The Maasai are interesting in that they have resisted all attempts to, quote, civilize them. They live in their traditional way. They wear their traditional dress. They keep their culture and their language, and they won't let anybody mess with it. One of the interesting things about their culture is that they have specific graded training for boys and girls. I know more about how they train boys. I had mostly contact with Maasai men. But, you have a little kid who is running around with his family and his mother until he reaches a certain age. Then he is taken off away from the village by elders, and he spends 2 years living in war bands, basically, where he learns the arts of being a Maasai. He learns how to fight with club and spear and shield and all of that kind of stuff. But at the same time, he learns all of the cultural morals of his culture. At a certain point, he graduates to being a warrior. You can tell the Maasai warriors, because they're all young, they all have long, beautiful hair, and they're like peacocks. They're always like, their hair is braided and beaded, and they're decked out in beautiful robes, and they're gorgeous, and you see them a lot. You walk down a street and you'll see 1 or 2 Maasai standing in front of various houses and buildings. And they're not loitering, they're the guards. Everybody in Tanzania knows that if you want to have a watchman or a guard who will actually take care of your place and not rob you blind, you hire a Maasai. Because they won't do it, because they have this chivalrous tendency that was inculcated in them as children. After a few years of this, when the tribe decides that they have matured enough, they become elders. You can tell a Maasai elder because he shaved off his head. He shaved off all of his hair, given up the the beautiful peacock aspect of their life. And they say, when you're a warrior, you think with your passions in your heart. When you become an elder, you think with your mind, and your job is to take care of everybody. And their moral compass is very large and very focused. I'll give you one example. The head watchman of some of my friends there was a man who I became good friends with. His name was Seningo. And one day he didn't show up for work. And he hadn't showed up for like 4 days. And everybody was going, oh, God, what happened to him? Because he's like one of the most totally reliable people that you will ever find. And then he shows up and they ask him, are you okay? What happened? And he had stood for a young man who had committed some crime, robbed something or got in trouble, got drunk, did something stupid, and had to appear before the magistrate. And the kid didn't show up. So the cops go to Seningo and they go, the kid didn't show up. Seningo marches down to the police station and he sits there taking the place of the kid. Well, Seningo's family goes out and hunts down the kid and brings him back. But for 4 days, he sat in the cop station going, I stood up for this guy, so I'm going to sit here until he comes back. You don't find that kind of behavior in most places anymore. But to me, the Maasai were like one of the last chivalrous cultures that you could come in contact with. Doesn't mean they're necessarily nice people. If you mess with one of their cows, they'll kill you. But if you don't mess with their cows, they'll leave you alone. But we don't have anything like that anymore. And in that culture, the young men become adults through experiencing the older men who have already become adults. And it is a line of transmission. It's handed down from generation to generation. And that is something that has some virtue.
Agreed.
Yeah, it sounds a lot like nature and nurture, doesn't it? Like this, what we're talking about is nurture, and then it's kind of got to match with the nature as well, because I see it in the community here that comes to me for counseling and stuff, where they've given, according to them, families have given their nurture, but the child is constantly going another way. And they can't, parents are like ripping their hair out thinking, what's going on? Why can't I? And then you'll have opposite. I had a young lady this week, family's totally dysfunctional. She's just a 13-year-old, but she's the adult in the family. So trying to have that match, and the embodiment, I think, is also really like not having that being taught to you where you become the peacock and get stuck there, but actually you embody it and it becomes your very nature. And I guess maybe that's what you were talking about when you did the alchemy series of making that thing turn and return back to its fitra. And the salihin, so those who do good become activated and active.
Yes. And one of the things that I see with what you're describing is, here you have a family and they have a kid who's out of control. And the family's a good family. But what they don't have anymore is the community. And the community, and this is where the chivalrous brotherhoods come in. The community is what puts brakes on the kid, because if the kid doesn't find a way to control themselves, the community will ostracize them. Their life will be unhappy. And when they find ways to control themselves, the community will support them. And we just don't have that anymore.
Yeah, another thing that comes to mind is in a community, you have, to some degree, you have a variety of people with a variety of strengths and ways of communicating, even within that general healthy cultural framework. So if that child were to find someone perhaps outside of the family who they could accept as a mentor and felt a sense of connection to, it's just another resource that is organically built into the system for them to find direction from that is supportive and nurturing. Sometimes you don't find that from your parents, even if they have the best of intentions. Sometimes there's someone else you need to turn to and get involved. We're all stuck in these small bubbles of community, then we don't have that many resources to take advantage of when it comes to finding mentors and stuff that are going to be meaningful connections that can be ongoing. Yeah. Thank you, Wow. Shuri, yeah.
It gets me thinking about, this is not just honor, this is actually a responsibility. So in our communities and families and our small circle of influence, it's taking responsibility as mature adults to say, hey, that's out of line, or you don't do that, or taking a vulnerable person who needs that influence and being able to teach them right on the spot, not waiting for, oh, that's not my child, that's not my responsibility. But we actually take responsibility in this modern age, because there's very few people who will do that. And when you're saying trying to find someone who will do that, well, we are those people that need to actually just step up. It's right in the moment. I see that with my nieces who are small, they're less than 10, and they do horrible things to each other. And I pull them up and I say, you know, this is blah, 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 or da, 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 da. And my mother said to me, she said, the auntie is such a valuable person to actually step in when the parents aren't there. They're not my children. I don't live with them, but I can imbue them with an idea that they think about it and they go, oh yeah, but it's constant reinforcement. That's the other thing.
Yeah, rapport as well.
And so when you've got the Maasai giving that constant reinforcement, they know exactly where they are. And actually, you know, when they're around me, they actually behave a bit better. You know, with other young adults that I'm seeing, you know, and just teaching them sometimes basic manners and things. I say, you know, you don't give me dead air, as in not responding, not saying anything, not replying. And they go, oh, and it doesn't even occur to them, you know, it's the normal response is dwindling, you know, in good manners and things like that. But honor and responsibility go hand in hand. And we have to step into the breach to actually do something like that. We have volunteer services in Australia, a lot of volunteer things for state emergency, fire and rescue, all these things. They're volunteer. Marine rescue, it's all volunteer. They don't get paid, but they're often manned by middle-aged and senior people. Young people don't really step into that. So I'm wondering about what's going to happen in Australia when these people die off. What's going to happen to our services, because we're not giving enough encouragement to young people to go into these places, meet an older person who's a living example of how to behave under crisis, under stress, and that in a way is a kind of a club. you know,
Yeah.
a gang. But
That's like
just,
a guild.
yeah, exactly. So, you know, we have to encourage young people. These are not rites of passage, but this is how we live. This is how we live as a community, as a family.
Yeah. Thank you, Shuri. Excellent thoughts. And James has an interesting question, which I think is
Yes.
important for us to.
And it's time for us to
connect
get
to.
there because we said we were going to.
Yeah. So James asks, so how does all of this hook up with Gurdjieff in particular?
Well, funny you should ask. We're going to be talking about this at length this evening. But Gurdjieff understood that to be human, to be an actual human being without quotes, as he said, requires that you develop objective conscience. And conscience is the ability to be subjective, intersubjective with another person or people or things, and act in such a way that your moral compass is always on. And a lot of his training moved towards this. A lot of his self-observation was about, how am I being a dick? And what can I do to fix that? You know, how am I behaving in a completely unconscious manner? And how can I behave consciously? What does it mean to actually have conscience? And one of the ways he did this was create within his system a school where people came both to live and study for periods of time and to visit on regular bases that allowed them to experience working in community. And ideally, at least by the time he developed his school in France, with senior students that could embody the qualities that people were looking for.
Yeah.
And that's how this ties together. And Gurdjieff came from the heart of the guild systems in Turkey, right? He was exposed to all of that from his childhood. And when I say Turkey, I mean Greater Turkey, the Turkestan, the giant, the lands of the Turkic-speaking peoples, which goes all the way to China. So that's a big difference. That's a big landscape that we're looking at, not just the modern country of Turkey.
Yeah.
But he was exposed to that from earliest childhood. If you read his semi-autobiography, and
yes. So we have a question or a thought from Well.
yes.
I'm not too sure whether it's a question or a thought or both. But,
Could be both.
it was just something that emerged when I heard when somebody mentioned that we're up against quite a bit of a big hurdle, a big obstacle.
Yeah, M. Yeah.
Yes, when M was saying that we live in a world with such powerful influencers, and it doesn't really matter whether you're from Australia or Dubai. It spreads fast and it's all over the place. And I think Jonathan mentioned something about the ability to go and find someone noble and copy them and shadow them, so to speak.
That's a good word for it. Yeah, shadowing.
Yeah, and I mean, in my culture, my son's getting to the age now where he has to shadow me. I have to take him everywhere, and he doesn't need to say anything. He just needs to be my shadow, and in that process, pick up a few things that would otherwise not be picked up. But I think what I'm trying to point to is, I feel that maybe the only way for us to go up against the machine, if we want to call it that, is to do the work on ourselves. Because from my understanding from Mushtaq, basically from today's session, I understand that chivalry is an action, it's a doing. And the Sufi component is one's ability to work on themselves, or at least how I interpret the Sufi component, is one's ability to work on themselves so that they end up being the person that does the good stuff. Everybody knows what's good, but they don't get to do it, especially if their inner self, their commanding self is firmly in rule, and that takes work. And the work is what this school does. At least that's what it does for me. It gives me the practical practices to self-observe, to self-witness, to self-remember, to do my dhikr. These are all things that make me, well, hopefully, a person that not only knows what's right, but becomes a living, as much as I can, a living embodiment of it that allows things to be pulled towards me like a planet. I don't aim to pull them in, they just come. But I think that's a result of the work. I don't know much about Jordan Peterson or Andrew Tate. I've seen their pictures. But I guess the work that we do in the school and the practices that you guys are sharing, specifically in the Sufi group, because that's where the bulk of my experience comes in, I think is the only thing that we have. If because we live in a society where we don't have that. I couldn't shadow my father. It's just, and I don't blame him. It's just, that was his lot in life. He had to be somewhere, and I couldn't reach him. But to be able to do that for somebody else takes a lot of work. And I think the only thing, I think, with M's point and Jonathan's point, because that community isn't there and it won't come back. But what can happen is us doing it for ourselves, and doing the work. That's it. That's what came out. Thank you.
Yeah. And it's true that we're never going to get that back in the way that it was. Different time. But there are other expressions of it. For instance, well, your school. Anybody who comes to your school is going to be exposed to chivalrous conduct.
See Jefferson nodding emphatically. So, yeah, clearly.
You know, I want to say here, because, you know, that came up for me in an emotional way earlier in this conversation, because I got to witness a little bit happening at the school. Didn't at the time connect it to the subject, but very much so, Brother Weil, that is happening there, regardless of where you were on your journey. To me, it was happening then. That was 2018, I guess. But so thank you.
It's awesome.
Yeah,
thanks for sharing,
and
Jefferson.
Yeah, this is the whole the point of Sufism 2.0. We are evolving with the times and finding ways to do what we do that work for this. And a martial arts school may be a new school of chivalry. These talks interject ideas. We create community, as hard as it might be sometimes.
Can I just add there, actually, you know, my children went to karate when they were growing up, and that's where they learned a lot of good morals and how to be with your brother, your sister, your family, your community. And I myself learned, as I took them, I would sit and watch and listen, and I'm a great advocator of creating community, even if it's 5-10 people, to bring them around and do the storytelling, do the modeling, do the engaging in deeper thought and questioning and all of that stuff. And I think whatever profession we're in, we can find creative ways of creating that little, we don't know who's it going to affect and who's going to take it on board, but we do it not for the outcome, but because it's the right thing to do. And I guess that's what embodiment of this work is, really, for our own self. And that when you're working for that self, then the greater self is you anyway. So it automatically encompasses that, which is beautiful. That karate teacher ended up teaching their students to be teachers, and it's become a big school here in Sydney. So they're continuing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's kind of the thing that has to happen. You look at what will young people be interested in? And martial arts is always one of them.
Jonathan had to go. Okay.
Yeah.
I'll see him later. That's good. Yeah. Jefferson, sure.
Yeah. It stuck with me, the image of the fight between Ali and the in that story of having your face spit upon in a battle situation. And there's something about the modern era and screen-based relating, what I think of as like mimetic ideology battles, where it's like it's just spit. It's just we live in this age of spit. And then I thought of what would it take, because I've never been faced with it, but what would it take to be spit upon in that way and have something that's governing? That just popped into my head, something that Mushtaq said in an earlier talk about in the beginning was the ratio. And I was thinking, this chivalry, spiritual chivalry, has to do with how one's ratio is governed, the governance of the ratio within the individual. And it's very inspiring and very daunting at the same time. But if this was a boring conversation for the public, then too bad for them, because I'm very, moved internally and inventorying and whatnot. So in great appreciation.
Yeah. Well, we occasionally do boring talks just to keep the lightweights away. Now, the thing that happens is, here you are, and you're a young person, and you go out and you get into a fight at school. And then what usually happens? You go to the principal's office, whatever, you get kicked out for 3 days. But what doesn't happen these days is you don't have anybody to go, I got into a fight at school, and have them say, why did you get into a fight at school? This kid pissed me off. And then have the person they're talking to say, you know what I do when I find myself getting angry? I do this breath practice that helps me control my emotions so that I don't get angry. Then I can deal with this situation in a much more reasonable manner. And if the kid who is bothering me needs his ass kicked, then I can do it in a really calm, straightforward manner. But most of the time I can avoid the ass kicking part entirely because my emotions are in check. That is like the most perfect advice you could get, and nobody's getting it anymore. How do you control an upwelling of mechanically generated emotion? I mean, when I was a kid, most of that kind of stuff started out with things like, your mother wears army boots, right? And then you get emotion around that. The emotion is completely irrational and meaningless. And if you knew how to breathe, you would be going, that's a weird thing to say, and walk off.
Today, yeah, in-person fights happen, but I mean, I think for every person, they're more likely to have this kind of reaction, and I'm thinking of like online, and that's a whole rabbit hole we don't need to get into, but that is such a trigger for people. They see some comment from somebody and they feel threatened and they need to respond, and it becomes this
It's like that cartoon. Not now, Martha, somebody is wrong on the internet.
Yeah, and sometimes people say really hurtful things to you. So how it's important even then to take a breath before responding. If you respond at all, it's still important to take that pause and to reground yourself and to, as Em has been saying, like stay embodied so that you don't just head off into space towards your impulsive reactions that may just cause a whole waterfall of drama that you never really needed to precipitate in the first place. People are going to be assholes. Other people are going to do that. How do you respond to that? Yes.
You know, here in Australia, there's the movement of mindfulness, and that's what they're aiming to do, to remember to come back to the breath, to take a moment, to check inward and all of that. But it's now, consumerism has also hijacked that, I think, and also now become just another thing that has no real substance. And even when it's, you know, invited to practice, it's like a 2-minute thing that isn't 2-minute thing. Like it's not real, being like taking it from that deeper source space, but it's this head thing. And then it's just another head thing, you know, another mechanical thing now. And then people try to be politically correct around it. Oh, I feel so better now. Da, da, da. But it's not. It's just not. Energetically, it hasn't kicked in. And I've been often wondering, I mean, the mindfulness came through the Buddhist kind of tradition into the scientific world, and that's kind of now put it into education, into mental health area. All sectors are kind of getting a taste of it. But I'm feeling that I've been doing a lot of thinking around that, and it just always comes back to that it's not from, the line is not coming from a deeper source, but it's almost like a, maybe it is, but it's been hijacked. That tap's been hijacked, and it's just bottled water rather than coming from the spring.
Yeah, and I think this ties back to what we were saying earlier about, oh my gosh, I lost the thought. Working on ourselves so that we can demonstrate what it looks like to practice it in a more realized way, as opposed to, oh yeah, it's self-care. I take a couple breaths and I pretend that I feel better.
Working on ourselves, but as you guys are providing for us, opening the space to have the conversation, so you've got words to explain what you're doing that people are seeing, for instance, or you are feeling, that you have some language around it. You have, as hard as some of the language might be, because it's Arabic or Farsi or Turkish or Chinese or whatever, but to go back to that source and put the garment of language on it, so that the mind isn't in battle with the spirit. Because it's this external fight that's going on outwardly. It's actually an internal fight with our own mind and our own heart.
Yeah.
The child in us and the adult, or trying to be adult in us, like that's the one that's having the battle. And we need language to tell even ourselves to be grounded and join the air and the earth, fire and the water.
Yeah. There is an economic rule that applies here. And this goes back to like 15th century or something. And it states, if the king minteth two coin, one pure and the other debased, the debased coin will drive out the pure.
Yeah. This
Which is,
I want to pull in James's comment because there's something related
let
to
me
that.
finish this thought real quick here. When it comes to things like mindfulness is at its basis, in its pure form, is really cool. But its pure form actually requires time and effort. If you want to be good at the techniques that are being called mindfulness, you're going to need to devote months, if not years, to their cultivation. Whereas if you are willing to put out the debased coin of mindfulness, which is to say, oh, take this 3-hour workshop and learn how to be mindful, you will actually do better. You know, Jordan Peterson, Andrew Tate, they have millions of followers. We have, under 2,000 people who are following us on YouTube. That's because we don't offer quick fixes. And everybody wants the quick fix. Everybody wants the 3-hour mindfulness course that guarantees that all of your problems will be solved. And they don't want to hear, this is going to take time. It's going to take work. You're going to come up against your shit. You're going to have to deal with that. Here's the tools to deal with it. Get prepared. It's not as much fun.
Yep. Yeah. So in brief, James was mentioning like the dilution of mindfulness practice, which is exactly what you're talking about. Yeah. James, did you want to speak?
Just not only its dilution, but its over application as therapy on people who can't handle it. The whole Vipassana retreat suicide phenomenon, that people who are not even remotely ready for this sort of radical challenge to their sense of identity and breakdown, and which after the initial enthusiasm of mindfulness as therapy, you're now seeing its modification. And the whole difference between, like, remedial and generative practice.
Yeah, which I was going to bring up, which is relevant. Yeah.
As a remedial practice, it's now being heavily modified, and other aspects are introduced. And there's the recognition that not everyone can cope with mindfulness, nor are they obliged to, for purely remedial work. That's kind of my point. And knowing the original cultural context of mindfulness would have helped people to arrive at that understanding a lot quicker, I think.
Yeah. Well, that's a great point, and that's why we start with breath work, because that is the grounding tool where everything gets started.
And even then, sometimes we have to dial people back on that.
Yeah, you're
and
right
say, don't do this intense breath work. Do this easy breath work first.
I was one of those people. Yeah.
Yes.
I took it to. I took it more seriously, quote unquote, than it needed to be taken as a beginner. Meaning I was too aggressive about it. And that stressed me out, and it was counterproductive. Jefferson says, perhaps some of the practices you are sharing as a way to practice or serve a remembrance of chivalry from or between self to self. Are a way. Yeah, Jefferson, I'm not quite clear on your thought here. Would you like to speak to that?
Sure. Well, so it was self, capital S,
Yes,
S,
it's hard to
self, small s. and just remembrance in the sense that, you know, if one's to engage with something, you know, with the divine, that there'd be let's maybe say one way to get beyond the amnesia that exists so much in the world. The you know, you're talking about the Maasai and that lineage, all those lineages and broken lineages. And I think the modern world is suffering from massive broken lineages, but these practices as ways to reconnect to a divine lineage. And so therefore chivalry be past, you know, big S self to small S self.
Yeah. And I think you're exactly right. You know, the old lineages have been broken. We need new ones. We need ways to approach this that work in the 21st century. It's like, that's why Noor and I are doing what we're doing here, because it is not easy for people to travel to where a teacher is sitting and spend time with them, you know, away from their family, away from their job, and all of that sort of thing. That was the old traditional way of doing it. That's the way I came up. Is, you know, I would travel 3 hours one way to sit with my teacher, or I would fly, depending on which teacher, I would fly halfway around the world. And that's hard. I mean, I had to make certain choices, like I'm not going to have a family. You know, that was one of my first choices. I cannot support a family and do what I'm doing. So I'm not going to have a family. I'm going to devote my life to seeking enlightenment and being a dojo bum. And we have to have ways where more people can have access to this material without having to blow up their lives to get it. I mean, what if Siddhartha Gautama didn't have to leave the palace behind and go off and sit under the tree? What if he could have just gotten on Zoom and talked to the people who could say, meditate like this? Would have been a different story. Might have been a very interesting story, but who knows?
James, did you have a thought?
Something that might be relevant to the conversation in general, both the chivalry, and we have talked a lot about male role models and manhood as well.
Yeah.
There's a book that came out a while ago by the traditionalist Charles Upton called Hammering Hot Iron, a critique of Robert Bly's Iron John. The traditionalists kind of freak me out. They have a morbid obsession with Kali Yuga and a lot of literalism, and I'm sort of, but they often have very interesting critiques, particularly the confusion of spiritual and psychological work. But the whole Iron John thing was the first glimmering of the men's movement, however. Yeah. And Upton critiques it from the point of view of spiritual psychology, and he's sort of the Sufism, he was just starting to get into at that point, and it just might be a relevant resource for this theme.
Yeah.
That's all.
I would not trust Charles Upton's work personally.
By virtue of?
Knowing him.
Oh.
It's funny because he's come up like a couple of times this week for whatever reason. And he's not a bad fellow, but I wouldn't want to grow up to be him. And that's my ultimate criteria is, would I want to grow up to be this guy? That's why I never studied Crowley.
I know nothing of him on a... Yeah, well, Crowley's life was out there for everyone to see, and he wanted it that way, but I don't know anything about Upton on a personal level. Just some of his written material and his critiques seem to be interesting.
He's written a lot of books. Yeah, and he is a thinker.
Except for the whole traditionalist, I'm a bit wary of the traditionalists overall, but out of that lot, he seemed to be interesting and relevant.
As far as female female role models or non-male role models. That's definitely been a challenge, especially when we're talking about the fact that there's not a lot of, I mean, up until recently, now we have like Facebook posts that talk about women who have done some really incredible things. But growing up, when I was little, I didn't have the internet yet. And even through my teens, I didn't have the social media we have now that highlights these non-male figures who really have lived lives worth emulating or learning from. And so we turn to like TV people and characters in novels and things like that, because that's what we have access to. And that's definitely not nothing, but it is not ideal. I know that in my immediate circle, I mean, my grandmother, both of my grandmothers, all three of them really were pretty incredible people. So they gave me examples of a womanhood that was really coming from a place of personal strength and wanting to be out in the world doing cool things. My grandmother went skydiving at 91 years old. So she was also divorced at a time where divorce was like anathema. It was shocking, it was shameful, and she did it anyway because she knew the kind of life she wanted for herself. So I had examples like that, but I did not necessarily have examples of chivalry, let's say. And so, yeah, this is something where I kind of have to learn what that looks like for me as I go, and to take what I see in others and see how I can apply that to my own life in ways that are doable for me. And this also includes being a person with disabilities. There was no point in my life where I was going to run out and be a physical role model in the sense of being strong and fit and kicking ass.
You weren't going to be Billie Jean King.
Yeah, so I kick ass in other ways. I'm going to have to show that sense of warriorship in ways that are appropriate for me and for my body.
Yeah, and it's interesting because there are examples of women in chivalry, most of which have been swept under the Persian carpet of history.
Yeah, exactly.
In the West, I mean, chivalry started out as in part having a code of conduct towards women. At a time when women were property and you could pretty much do anything you wanted, here you had these rules that said, don't treat women that way. And that culminated in the personage of Eleanor of Aquitaine, who was wife to two kings and mother to two kings, and a remarkable woman. She was raised in part in Palestine, where she came in contact with lots of Sufi types. When she returned to Europe, she brought musicians with her. She brought traditional, Middle East Arab musicians to play at her court. And it always pisses people off when I point out that the troubadour movement started in Palestine, but it did. She created the troubadour movement to a great extent. She created what were called the courts of love. And what these were ways to actually experience the other as subject. You had these people called troubadours, which were both male and female, who would compose poetry that was very reminiscent of Hafiz or Rumi or any of the other great medieval Eastern poets that produced beautiful love poetry. They produced music, and they did deeds of valor, and they had rules for how to be with the other. a lot of which had to do with, oh, you're attracted to this person. You don't get to jump in bed with them immediately. You have to wait. You have to hang out. You have to, if you're a man, you have to be the woman's servant. You have to demonstrate your worthiness to approach her. If you're a woman, you have to be a little bit harder to describe. You have to be present to your suitor without falling into any of the mechanical traps. And I mean, Eleanor and her daughter would actually hold courts to give judgment on how people behaved during this time. You know, one suitor could go and say, this woman who I have been courting is being savage towards me, meaning she's not, her behavior is inappropriate. And they would listen and decide whether it was the truth and say, lighten up, or tell this guy that you're just not interested, or whatever.
So by savage, which I mean, that's pretty vague, but perhaps like dismissive and condescending.
Yeah, not treating him as subject.
Yeah.
And it created something that echoes through the subconscious of Western Europe to this very day. Not as loudly as one might like, but it's still there. And people say that it was a Sufi plot. It probably was, but we aren't admitting to anything.
We've covered a lot of ground. This is
and much longer than I thought it was going to be. I thought this was going to be a short talk.
Sorry, not sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Any last questions before we wrap this up? Because people are having to leave and we've been going on and on and on.
Yeah. Yes. All right. I mean, it looks like everyone has shared what they needed to share. And of course, we are going to be returning to this topic to some extent this evening. So that should be kind of a continuation of this discussion, but with more expansion, literally, I guess we could say. Yeah, we're going to be talking about community and shapes of community relative to this kind of work. All right, everyone, are we in Brady Bunch mode?
Yes, we are.
Okay, we can wait
See y'all later.
Wait to everyone watching. See you later today. Bye.